Jacob had a dream. And within that dream, Jacob had a confirmation, a blessed assurance, if you will, that despite his faults, despite the fact that he would wrestle with God, Jacob would still continue to be blessed, and the Lord would be with him, and the Lord would fulfill his promise to Jacob. They would have a covenant. I'd like to talk a little bit about Jacob this afternoon. Jacob's name means he grasps the heel. This is the account of his birth and his background some chapters back in the Old Testament. Abraham became the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel and Arameah, from Padan and Aram, the sister of Laban and Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you. You will be separated. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first one to come out was red. His whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so that he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished, and said, "Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Genesis 25:21 through 34. It's interesting when we read this story and we look at Jacob's background and who he was. We also have to look at the time and the culture of the Old Testament in which this was written. Jacob was the second-born son. In the time and culture of Genesis, the eldest or the firstborn son was placed on a pedestal. All the hopes and dreams of the family were placed on the firstborn son. He would be the leader. He'd be the new family leader. All the hopes and honor were typically bestowed on the firstborn. And in a world ruled by men, it's also interesting that in this story, we have the eldest son who is favored by the father, a man's man, a hunter, came in second to the second-born son, who was sort of a mama's boy, who stayed at home in the tents, was quiet. He was the chosen one by God. I love this concept because it shows that God sometimes turns the world's view of things on its head, much like he did with his son, who said, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." But even though Jacob was an unlikely victor, the second-born son, the quiet one, was victorious over his brother. Was he without his flaws? Those of you who remember Jacob, he was a flawed human being. He was deceitful. He lied. He tricked his brother out of his birthright. It's also interesting that later on, Jacob would seem to pay for that mistake. He'd have to work, later on in Scripture, he'd have to work another 7 years to get the wife that he wanted. He would also be tricked by his sons later on in Genesis. His sons would lie to him and tell him that his favorite son Joseph was dead when they sold him into slavery. But those are other stories. Jacob, although chosen by God, was not a perfect person, but neither are we. And we are all, in fact, chosen by God for something. Jacob had a lot of problems. He wasn't perfect, neither was his father Isaac, nor his grandfather Abraham, whom God made the original promise to. All these men eventually became wealthy and powerful, accomplished great things, and earned the respect of their peers. But this didn't happen because they had some great character. It happened because they were in constant relationship and constant commune with God. They built a relationship with the Creator. Jacob, like his father and grandfather, went on to do great things, even though he was capable of selfishness, dishonesty, and deceit. Yes, quite often his motives and behavior were questionable. But like us in our own individual journeys, he was coming to his own and discovering who he was, and discovering who he was in God. Jacob's life had 4 stages. These stages were marked by 4 encounters with God. And the first, we see him living up to his name, grabbing the heel of his older brother, presumed to be stronger. This foreshadowed his life. He cheated his brother out of his birthright with the help of his mother and had to run away from home because his brother sought to kill him. During this flight, God first appeared to him. God confirmed his blessing despite his sins, despite his imperfections. God affirmed who he was. God affirmed God's plan for him. As LGBT Christians, we know how important it is to have affirmation from God. We know how important it is to have God affirm who we are. As LGBT Christians, we know how important it is to have our identity affirmed. In the second encounter with God, we see Jacob praying for his mistakes. Paying for his mistakes. We see him learning. We see him growing. He's tricked. Instead of being the one who is tricking, he's tricked by his future father-in-law to work an extra 7 years for the wife he wanted. He's learning from his mistakes. In our journeys, we learn from our mistakes. And there's considerable growth in his character because the younger Jacob would have simply left Laban. But here, Jacob waits on God's permission. In the third stage, Jacob was the grabber again. He met God through an angel in the wilderness at the Jordan River. He then wrestled with the angel, overpowered him, and the man said, "Let me go." Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." After asking Jacob his name, he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled with God and men and came out victorious." Jacob asked the man his name. He did not answer. Instead, he blessed him and disappeared. And as LGBT Christians and people of faith, we too know what it is like to wrestle with God, to wrestle with our interpretation of God, to wrestle with Scripture, and finally to be blessed with affirmation of our identity. His relationship with God also became essential in his life, and his name was changed to Israel, which means he struggles with God. And in the fourth stage, we see Jacob being even more reliant on God, waiting on God's approval for everything. Jacob's story reminds me of another journey of someone who wrestled with God and relied on God. I'm reminded of the story of our denomination's founder, Reverend Troy Perry. In 1968, a year before New York's Stonewall riots, a series of most unlikely events in Southern California resulted in the birth of the world's first church group with a primary positive ministry to gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender persons. Those events, a failed relationship, an attempted suicide, a reconnection with God, an unexpected prophecy, and the birth of a dream led to MCC's first worship service, a gathering of 12 people in Reverend Troy Perry's living room. That was October 6th of 1968. In the early 60s, Reverend Troy Perry was defrocked as a clergy person by a Pentecostal denomination because of his homosexuality. He spent the next several years struggling to reconcile his sexuality and his Christian spirituality. There are 4 stages of his story as well. After being defrocked because of his sexuality, Troy Perry distanced himself from God and church like so many of us do. How many of us have had the story where we left the church world, we left the congregation, we went out and drank, we went out and got addicted, we went out and had meaningless premarital sex, the bar lifestyle, right? Happens to so many of us. Like so many of us in our past, when we felt God was against us, we fled from religion. We tried to flee from God. But you know what? God never lets us go, even when we flee from Him. Even when we ignore God's presence, God is still with us. Troy had distanced himself from God. One evening he came home and his lover Benny told him that their relationship was over. Troy Perry was distraught. He had built his life around everything. He had built everything around this man that he had a relationship with. Troy would later say that that was the problem, that that man had taken the place of God. He had worshipped the creature instead of the Creator. He had put one human being before God. Troy felt destitute. He went into the bathroom to shave and came to the conclusion to take his own life. Sobbing, he got into the bathtub with a razor blade from the bathroom and slit his wrists. Later on, he awoke in a hospital. His former lover, Benny, and the neighbors found him in a bloody mess in the bathroom and took him to the Los Angeles County General Hospital, where, in the hospital, he was visited by a mysterious woman who handed him a religious literature saying, "Some of us here care about you." She turned and walked away, and that started Troy to praying and talking to God again. It was here that Troy began to rely on the love of his friends and neighbors. One of them was a woman named Vera, who had special insight, and she told him one day, "God has a ministry for you." At first he laughed at her. But she began to tell him things about himself that awakened him. Here he felt God was moving him in the direction of ministry again. In the second stage, soon after, Troy rekindled his relationship with God by praying until one night one of his friends, Carlos, was arrested in a bar by the police. Back in those days, the police used to raid gay bars and arrest men for simply being who they were. They would go in there undercover, they would enter the bar, make up some bogus charge, and take gay men to jail. In those days, many gay men were not out to their families, their jobs, and their churches. And if you were, it could ruin your life. The police threatened Carlos, saying that they were going to call his employer and get him fired because he was gay. Troy knelt down to pray and asked God, "If you really want me to start a church, tell me when." He heard a small voice say, "Now." The third God incident was the first church service that Troy Perry had in his living room with only 12 people. They worshiped God, they loved God, they wrestled with God, and ultimately God continued to bless them because the numbers kept going up. The next Sunday there were 14 members. The next Sunday there were 16. But there were some setbacks. They did have dwindling numbers. There were also church bombings, such as the 1973 arson attack on the upstairs lounge where the church had been meeting, where 32 people were killed, including the senior and associate pastor. There was also Anita Bryant and her campaigning against the LGBT community in the late 70s and the AIDS crisis in the 80s. Nevertheless, God was still with the church, and their numbers kept increasing, and not only were they ministering to God's queer folk, but heterosexuals as well. In the fourth stage, the MCC Church is still here today, and the ministry of Troy Perry is still alive. We are still walking with God, and God is still blessing us. God is still with us in our journey. Despite our current crises, and the world we are living in. I'd like to return to the story where Jacob was wrestling with God. In this story, Jacob, like Troy Perry, set out for the unknown. There are times in our lives where it feels like we are at odds with God, and we wonder if God is really here. Sometimes we might wonder if God is really for us. Sometimes we might wonder if God has really blessed us. We wonder when we experience trials and tribulations or heartache if God has abandoned us. Sometimes some of us may even wonder if there is a God. Doubt and temptation set in. Doubt per se is not necessarily a bad thing. Through questioning, we can come to a better understanding of our faith. A friend of mine who I went to seminary with now identifies as an atheist. When I asked her why, she said it started with her reading the Bible by herself. Really reading the Bible. That's why biblical literalism is a heresy. When doubt leads us to temptation of giving up into despair, that is when doubt is harmful and contrary to what God has planned for us. We may feel trapped because of the state of the world with the COVID-19 pandemic. We may feel disheartened because of the blatant bigotry that is so apparent in the news and from our nation's leaders. Some of us have lost our jobs. We may not be sure where our relationships and families are headed. It is tempting to give up on God and to doubt God's existence. But you know, it has been my experience that during those times, God always shows up. God always does something to remind us that He hasn't left us. Yes, sometimes we wrestle with God. I know I do. Sometimes we shout at God. Sometimes we curse God. And even in times when I have temporarily let go of God, God has shown me that He or she has not let go of me. I'm not a perfect person. Neither was Jacob. Neither was Troy Perry. And during those times of destitute, remember that you're in good company. Even Jesus at the cross said, "Why have you forsaken me?" As Christians or followers of the way, we should not rely on the idols of religion, for it itself can become an idol. But instead, we should rely on authentic, real relationship with the Creator. There have been times in my life where I've yelled at God. There have been times in my life where I've cursed at God. That may shock some of you. But a relationship, if it's a real one, isn't always hunky-dory. Those of you who are married, do you get along with your spouse all the time?
Preach it. Preach it.
In a marriage, there's always some form of disagreement. There's a healthy way to go about it and an unhealthy way to go about it. But because you are married and committed and in a covenant relationship with your spouse, you don't throw in the towel at the first or second time of trouble. You stay persistent. If the relationship is healthy, you stay persistent. You wrestle with them and you wrestle with yourself. God values authenticity and persistence. And I can tell you many times when I have abandoned God, He always does something to get my attention. God has promised us as individuals and as a church that there is a place for us. There is a promised land. There is a blessing. And sometimes it means wrestling with God. It always involves open communication. Sometimes also what seems like a curse can actually be a blessing. I remember about 16 years ago, before I met Johnny, I was with another man who ended up dumping me because he didn't want to be tied down to a relationship. This was right before I went to seminary. I thought then my life was over because I had revolved my life around this man, instead of being okay with me and consistent with God. After going to seminary and coming to my own, I learned to rely on God. And I finally met my soulmate. my husband, whom I've been with for 15 years.
Amen.
I'm thankful for how things turned out because I have built a wonderful life with Johnny. We have fostered children together. Even though they are back in their mother's custody, God has opened doors of communication and allowed us to stay in their lives. Now we are going through yet another challenge. Since we have lived in Lexington nearly 5 years, Johnny has accepted a job offer here in Dayton. So yet again, we are moving back to Dayton, Ohio.
Yay!
This isn't the first time. If you know us, you know we've gone back and forth from Dayton, Kentucky, Dayton, Kentucky, Dayton, Kentucky. I've lost count, honestly. I think this is the 4th time. I can't remember. The truth is, I'm not really excited about it. Although I prefer Dayton to Kentucky, the move takes us further from our kids. But we have made a commitment to stay connected and to remain in their lives, regardless of the distance. The truth is, I'm scared now about the future. I'm not sure what God has in store for me and my family. But throughout this time of uncertainty, throughout this time where our world is really experiencing the unknown, let us remember that God still keeps God's promises, even in times of doubt. But let us ask ourselves, are we like young Jacob, young Troy Perry? Do we force God to track us down in the wilderness? Or are we like the mature Jacob and the mature Troy Perry who placed their wants and desires on God's approval before taking action? Let us, as a church, as a people, and as individuals, continue to grow, walk, and wrestle with God. Amen.